Imagine this. A ruthless king issues a chilling decree: every baby boy born to your people must be thrown into the river. You're just an ordinary woman, a slave in Egypt, with no power, no voice, except you're holding your newborn son in your arms. His tiny fingers wrap around yours, his breath soft against your skin. You know one thing: you cannot let him die. But how do you defy the most powerful empire in the world? How do you protect your child when soldiers lurk around every corner, ready to rip him from your arms? This is the story of Jochebed, a woman who didn't just break the rules, she outsmarted an empire. She placed her baby in the very river meant to kill him, setting off a chain of events that would one day bring Egypt to its knees. But here's the twist: she had no idea that her desperate act of faith would change the course of history forever. Stay with me, because this is not just a story about survival. It's about courage, faith, and the kind of love that rewrites destinies. The story is found in the book of Exodus chapter 2 verses 1 to 10 and chapter 6 verses 20. Jochebed's heart pounded as she cradled her newborn son in her arms. His tiny face, peaceful and unaware, nestled against her chest. But outside, Egypt was a land of terror. The Pharaoh's decree echoed in her mind like a death sentence. Every Hebrew baby boy must be thrown into the Nile. Jochebed's people, the Israelites, had been enslaved for generations, forced to build Pharaoh's grand cities under the scorching sun. But now, Pharaoh feared them. He saw their growing numbers as a threat, a potential rebellion. His solution? Genocide. Jochebed had already given birth to 2 children: Miriam, her sharp-witted daughter, and Aaron, her lively little boy. But this time was different. This baby was born under Pharaoh's death order. Every wail of her child could bring soldiers to her door. Every passing neighbor could be a risk. And yet, how could she silence an infant? How could she stop being a mother? For 3 months, she did the impossible. She hid him. She smothered his cries under blankets, nursed him in silence, and prayed fervently, whispering his name only in the safety of her home. But time was running out. He was growing. His cries were getting louder. And soon, she knew, they would come for him. Jochebed's hands trembled as she wove the reeds together, crafting a small basket. It wasn't much, just a crude vessel coated with tar to keep it from sinking. But this wasn't just any basket. This was an act of faith. Tears blurred her vision as she placed her son inside. His little eyes gazed up at her, trusting, innocent. Did he sense her fear? Did he somehow know that she was about to release him into the unknown? Miriam, watching nearby, swallowed hard. "Mother, is this the only way?" Jochebed nodded. There was no other way. If she kept him, he would be found and killed. If she released him into the river, at least there was a chance, no matter how small. She kissed his forehead, lingering, memorizing every feature. Then, with trembling hands, she placed the basket into the waters of the Nile. The river that had swallowed countless Hebrew boys now held her son. She let go. Jochebed could barely breathe as she watched the current carry the basket away. Miriam, her ever-brave daughter, followed from a distance, her small feet darting behind the reeds. Minutes passed like hours. Then, movement. A group of women approached the riverbank, their laughter floating in the warm air. Jochebed's breath caught in her throat. The royal women. And leading them was Pharaoh's daughter. Jochebed's heart pounded. The princess knelt near the water's edge, her eyes catching something unusual: a basket. Curiosity flashed across her face as she waded into the water and pulled it in. She opened it. A baby's cry pierced the air. The princess gasped, and then, something unexpected happened. Instead of calling for the soldiers, instead of ordering the child to be drowned, she smiled. Jochebed, still hidden, watched in stunned silence. Pharaoh's own daughter was holding her son not as an enemy, but as a mother. "This must be a Hebrew child," the princess murmured. But there was no disgust in her voice. No anger. Only compassion. At that moment, Miriam stepped forward. Small but fearless, she bowed before the princess. "My lady, shall I find a Hebrew woman to nurse the child for you?" The princess turned to the little girl and nodded. "Yes. Do that." Miriam ran as fast as her legs could carry her. She darted through the streets, breathless, until she reached her home. "Mother, come quickly." Jochebed barely understood before she was being pulled toward the palace. Minutes later, she stood before Pharaoh's daughter. The princess held out the baby, smiling. "Take him. Nurse him for me. I will pay you." Jochebed's knees nearly buckled. Her son, back in her arms, under the protection of the royal household. The very empire that sought to destroy him would now raise him. Jochebed raised her son in the early years of his life, knowing her time was short. She whispered stories of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob into his ears. She told him of Yahweh, the God of Israel. She made sure that before he became an Egyptian prince, he would know he was first a Hebrew. And when the time came, she let him go again. He became Pharaoh's grandson, educated in the finest schools of Egypt. But deep down, the seeds his mother had planted never left him. Years later, that baby, Moses, would return. Not as an Egyptian prince, but as the deliverer of Israel. He would stand before Pharaoh and demand, "Let my people go." He would lead an entire nation out of slavery. All because one mother dared to defy an empire. Here are the lessons from the story. 1. Jochebed had no roadmap, no guarantees, and no assurance that her baby would survive. Yet, she acted in faith, trusting that God's unseen hand would do what she could not. Faith isn't the absence of fear, it's choosing to trust God despite it. Jochebed's decision to release Moses into the Nile was not a reckless move, it was a calculated step of faith. She had no idea how things would unfold, but she believed that God was greater than Pharaoh's decree. Many times in life, we face situations where the future seems bleak. We may not see how things will work out, but that doesn't mean God isn't working behind the scenes. The Bible reminds us in Hebrews 11 verse 1, "Now faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen." Faith requires action. Jochebed could have remained in fear, holding tightly to her son until the soldiers came. But instead, she let go. And in that surrender, she placed Moses into the hands of the one who had already ordained his future. When life presents you with an impossible choice, remember Jochebed. Faith doesn't mean you won't have to act, it means that when you do, you trust that God will meet you there. The impact of faith-driven decisions is often far greater than we can ever imagine. Jochebed had no idea she was raising the man who would one day lead a nation out of bondage. But God did. So, what impossible situation are you facing today? Instead of being paralyzed by fear, take a step of faith, because your act of trust today may change history tomorrow. 2. Jochebed didn't have years to raise Moses, but the short time she did have was enough to plant something in his heart that Egypt couldn't erase. Though he was raised in Pharaoh's palace with all the luxuries, wisdom, and traditions of Egypt, Moses never forgot who he was. How? Because Jochebed ensured that before he was handed over to royalty, he was first rooted in his heritage. She whispered the stories of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob into his ears. She taught him about Yahweh, the true and living God. A mother's influence isn't measured by how long she has with her children, but by what she deposits in them while they are with her. Proverbs 22 verse 6 says, "Train up a child in the way he should go, and when he is old, he will not depart from it." Even though Moses spent decades in an Egyptian palace, when the time came, he identified with his people rather than with Pharaoh's family. Mothers, never underestimate the power of the words you speak into your children's lives. You may not have control over their future, but you can plant seeds of faith, character, and truth that will take root and grow even in the most unlikely places. If Jochebed had been silent, Egypt would have raised Moses to be just another prince. But because she spoke, taught, and prayed, he grew into the leader who would deliver Israel. No matter how brief or long your influence may be, use it wisely. Your words, prayers, and faith can shape not just your child's destiny, but generations to come. 3. Jochebed placed Moses into the very river where Pharaoh ordered Hebrew babies to be drowned. And yet, that same river became the path to his salvation. The most surprising twist. Pharaoh's own daughter, the child of the man who wanted Moses dead, became the one to rescue and protect him. God often works through the most unexpected people and places to accomplish his plans. The very system that was designed to destroy Moses became the one that raised him. The palace that belonged to Israel's oppressors became the training ground for Israel's deliverer. How many times have we looked at difficult situations and thought, nothing good can come from this? We assume that because something appears hopeless, it is. But God sees differently. Isaiah 55 verses 8-9 reminds us, "For my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways, declares the Lord." Jochebed had no idea how God would save her son, but she trusted that he would. And God didn't just save Moses, he placed him in an environment where he would gain the knowledge, leadership skills, and confidence needed to stand before Pharaoh one day and demand Israel's release. So when life seems unfair, when it feels like everything is stacked against you, remember, God can use the very thing meant to harm you to elevate you. Sometimes, our deliverance comes from the most unlikely places. For, one of the hardest things in life is letting go of what we hold most dear. But often, our greatest breakthroughs come when we surrender our burdens into God's hands. Jochebed could have held on to Moses, but doing so would have led to his death. Instead, she made the painful decision to release him. And in that moment of surrender, God stepped in and orchestrated a miracle. Moses not only survived, but Jochebed got to nurse and care for him while being paid to do so. We often struggle with surrender because we fear losing control. But in reality, control is an illusion. Psalm 55 verse 22 says, "Cast your burden on the Lord, and he will sustain you." When we release our situations, dreams, and fears to God, we allow him to do what only he can do. What are you holding on to today? What are you afraid to release? Sometimes, God is waiting for you to let go so he can step in. Just like Jochebed, your surrender might just be the setup for your miracle. 5. To the human eye, Jochebed's story was one of desperation. But in God's plan, it was a divine setup. From the moment Moses was born, God's hand was at work. Every event, the timing of the princess arriving at the river, Miriam's quick thinking, Jochebed being chosen to nurse her own son, was orchestrated by him. We often panic when life feels out of control. We wonder where God is when things don't make sense. But the story of Jochebed reminds us that God is always working behind the scenes, even when we can't see it. Romans 8 verse 28 says, "And we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him." Jochebed had no clue how her story would end. She just did what she could and trusted God with the rest. And that's what we must do too. When life feels uncertain, when fear tries to take over, remember, God is always in control. Even in the darkest moments, his hand is guiding the story. Just like he did for Jochebed, he is working in ways you cannot see. So trust him. Even when the pieces don't make sense. Because one day, they will. Jochebed's story is more than just a historical account, it is a powerful testimony of what happens when faith defies fear. She was an ordinary woman, a slave with no earthly power, yet she outwitted an empire because she trusted in the unseen hand of God. Her courage not only saved her son but also set in motion God's plan for the deliverance of an entire nation. Her faith-filled actions remind us that no situation is too impossible for God to turn around. Even in the face of overwhelming odds, he is always working behind the scenes, orchestrating his divine purposes. And now, the question is, what will you do when faced with a moment of decision? Will you trust God when the future looks uncertain? Will you plant seeds of faith in those around you, even when you don't see immediate results? Will you surrender what you hold dear, believing that God's plans are greater than your fears? Jochebed's story isn't just history, it's a challenge to you today. Faith isn't just about believing, it's about acting on that belief, even when the outcome is unknown. So, what step of faith do you need to take today? Drop a comment below and let's continue the conversation. And if this story has blessed you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Scriptures in Pictures TV for more inspiring Bible stories brought to life. Stay tuned for our next powerful story, because when faith meets action, history is made. See you in the next episode.